So good afternoon, survivors. I'm going to sit and forgive me for doing so. I'm exhausted, and I'm not exhausted because it's so hard to sit all day. It's actually one of the easiest things besides lying all day, but because I find today's workshop, or the topic of today's workshop, which is, as I say it, the tremendous unnecessary suffering of people, very emotional, distressing. Good afternoon. My name is Litmanovitch, and I am the Program Director of the Mediterranean Neighbor Unit at the Van Leer, as well as the Associate Editor of the Journal of Levantine Studies, which is published at the Van Leer. I would like to start by thanking Dr. Benedetta Berti for putting together this wonderful, packed but in a positive way, workshop. Thank you, Benedetta. I would like to thank, of course, the Minerva Center for the rule of law under extreme conditions, Professor Salzberger, Professor Barzilai, and of course, Dr. Michal Ben-Gal for her ongoing assistance and help and cooperation. Thank you. I would like also to help the staff of the Van Leer, Shulamit Laron and Eyal Efron from the Public Events Department, Neri Leader and Tamara Badi, who is staying with us right now. They're from the Media Department. They are both working 12, 14 hours a day in this season of conferences and workshop. Thank you very much, Tamara. As well as my colleagues who help us through the day, Sophie Shor and Dr. Tzomeret Levi, my colleagues from the department, from the Mediterranean Neighbors Department. As you must remember, this workshop was formulated as the first step toward publishing a special issue of the Journal of Levantine Studies, JLS, about the topic of refugees, refugeedom in the MENA region. And the Journal of Levantine Studies, and I'm citing now, is an interdisciplinary peer-reviewed academic journal dedicated to the critical study of the geographical, social and cultural setting which in various periods of history have been known as the Levant. I didn't write it, but I stand behind it, I guess. Dr. Berti will serve as a guest editor of this issue, and we would like to encourage each and every one of you to submit a manuscript for a peer review for possible publication in, let's say, a deadline of 4 months? Yeah. Let's start with 4 months. I'll be in touch. We just have a special issue about the 100 years anniversary of the Armenian genocide, published today. There are some copies over there. You can look them through instead of looking at me. So, if we had another day or another week for this workshop, we should have explored more the historical dimension of refugeedom in the MENA region. The humanitarian crises in the Mediterranean have been around for some time, as some of you have touched upon. And we can mention Lebanon in civil wars and wars with Israel, displacement of 1 million to 2 million Kurds in Turkey during the 1980s, displacement of Palestinians and Syrians following the 1967 war. Yemen, Sudan, I'm not mentioning Palestine, Israel in 1948-49. I'm not mentioning, of course, Anatolia in 1915, 1916, which is something else. But all these serve as examples that there is a dimension, a historical dimension. And when looking on the agenda of the workshop, I ask myself, what is unique of the present state of the post-colonial, post-Cold War affairs of our region? And I guess that actually business are as usual, which is for an optimist maybe discouraging. We hear humanitarian rhetoric of states. The UN and its agencies, the Red Cross and other organizations, as we heard today, are all working to supply emergent needs of these dislocated people and refugees. Essentially, that's it. There are, as always, people who engage themselves in helping others, including the refugees in Turkey and the refugees in Greece. And it is true that governments of these states are really trying to manage the humanitarian crisis, as we heard today, when it comes to them. But they also try, as you all know, to leverage these attempts for political gains, for economical gains, or for both. And for all other states, like mine, well, they hide behind walls. So I guess what stays unique in today's crisis is all these crises happen here and now, as we speak. So people like us who live here and today can do something about them. And it is my great honor to meet you, people like you who are actually engaged in helping refugees either as scholars, as practitioners, or as both. So thank you very much for coming today.
Okay, so this is the part where after a really, really interesting morning, I try to say a very quick, I'll be brief because everybody's, I suppose, pretty tired, but I'll try to wrap things up and get us to the next stage. So I'd already started with the thanking the Minerva Center, the Leer Center, everybody who has been helping us organize this workshop, and I will just echo this round of thanking because I think it was a really interesting and productive day, and there was a lot of interaction between academics and practitioners and looking at the very complex and multi-layered situation in the region and its global implications. So let me echo those things, and also to take a special moment to also thank all the presenters, especially those that have been staying from the morning to now. You are real troopers, and in addition to that, really all the presentations were incredibly interesting. And that is something never to be taken for granted, especially in an academic setting, as you all know. So I really do not want this to be me rambling for 20 minutes because I don't think it's a good idea. So let me really get to the gist of what I think to some of the really interesting conversation that we started today, and I really hope we can begin to develop through the special issue and through future conversations as well, because of course this is a monumental issue, incredibly complex and incredibly relevant, not just to the future of our region, but I think in general. So how can we title today's conversation? My first instinctual reaction is to talk about welcome to the time of permanent emergency, or maybe never again, which is really what we are facing at the moment. In the sense that we are in a critical juncture in which we're facing simultaneous legal, political, social, and ultimately constitutive challenges to the existing templates for delivering basic humanitarian assistance, for offering protection, for dealing with complex and protracted crises. And in a way, unfortunately, this part of the world, the Mediterranean region, is becoming this laboratory of emphasizing, highlighting all these complex and multi-layered, interrelated problems. And I think we all dealt with this major category of this, how to deal with this age of permanent emergency, and the fact that we are both willing to acknowledge that that's what we're dealing with and unable to find the new tools. I think that one of the other main conversations that we had is how do you deal with the current nature of warfare and the fact that most of the provisions, legal, political, and policy-wise, in terms of dealing with them, are out-of-dated, politically misaligned with reality on the ground. We have a body of international humanitarian law largely written and thought for war between states. We largely are on the ground. Frozen conflicts, liminal conflict, areas between war and peace, civil wars, internal wars, low-intensity warfare. They are rapidly shifting line, a multiplicity of warring parties, clashing, converging and diverging factions, in which civilians have become at the very center of the battlefield, at the very center of these largely imagined front lines, and in which civilians are time and time again deliberately targeted through various tactics of warfare, from siege and starvation to sexual violence to deliberate targeting. Time and time again, and this was said throughout the day, the parties to the conflict, state and non-states alike, have something in common, which is the disrespect for the basic principle of international humanitarian law and the disrespect for the concept of a safe humanitarian space from which to intervene. How do we deal with that? We deal with that, first of all, with recognizing, I think, that this is the problem. The legal tools are written for a war that is no longer there. The international humanitarian law, for its most part, talks about conflicts that don't exist on the ground. The issue of enforcing responsibility, not just on states, but on non-state actors, is a major one that we've touched upon time and time again. We don't have enough tools. We talked about how do you offer robust and effective protection of civilians in the context of peacekeeping and peace enforcement. And we'll get to politics in a second. We talked about how do you do all this in an age in which concepts like statehood or sovereignty either stand in the way or prevent us from talking to the range of actors and over the range of issues that we need to in order to deliver effective protection and relief. All of this brings us to the shrinking humanitarian space that pretty much is a common theme that I saw in basically every single presentation, expressed with different examples and through different stories. So that's the permanent emergency. The other trend I saw connected to this permanent emergency is, in a world of permanent emergencies, budgets go up and they are not enough to deal with the concurrent prolonged crisis we have to deal with. The geographical boundaries explode in terms of where does the emergency start and finish. The time boundary, and that's something that we saw with I think it was very important to remember the issue of protracted refugee crisis. That's perhaps one of the best examples of the idea of this permanent emergency. When you explode the geographical and the temporal boundary, then you get into the issue of how do you deal with these multi-layered challenges of protection, relief, assistance, development, recovery, reconstruction. Where does one end? Where does the other begin in a world where most conflicts are between war and peace, and those boundaries are incredibly fluid? And then the other common trend, and I know I missed a lot of really important issues, but I'm trying to not to be too tedious. So the other common trend that I thought was very important and came across through and through today is, again, the elephant in the room, and that elephant is political limitations, because we can discuss the limitations in the existing legal frameworks. We can discuss the limitation in our categories to conceptualize and define emergencies, but ultimately one of the main obstacles that we find on the ground has to do with political will and lack thereof. So that's the elephant in the room that I think that recurs, that comes out time and time again in each and every presentation. Political will is lacking when it comes to resolving these permanent emergencies. Political will comes when the main modality through which to look at conflict is one of conflict management rather than resolution. And I think that sitting in Jerusalem, I can say that loud and clear, that conflict management doesn't work if it's not matched with a broader political approach that ultimately wants to resolve the conflicts. Because the emergencies that stay permanent become broader, and because the emergency that became in the global south don't stay there. I think there is an element of justice to that, but that's my personal opinion. But even if they didn't, there would be an element of strategic interest in taking them more seriously and not just looking at them at this limited management of the situation. So this we go back, lack of political will to solve the emergency. And Syria is the great case. We had a question, why don't they solve the war? Well, because it's a great geopolitical conflict, and until the parties involved are more interested in winning than in ending the conflict, that's what's going to happen. The other lack of political limitation is how do you deal with these massive fluxes of forced displacement when there is an increasing going back to group identity, to wanting to keep these boundaries, to mark this boundary between what us and them and the other and the foreign, which is, I thought, also a really, really interesting point from today. And just keep them out, keep them in the south, keep them in the camp, keep them there. It's an emergency. because in a way it kind of washes away our conscience. It's an emergency, it will end, what to do. And then the emergencies last for decades and the situation becomes one of de facto permanent crisis, and we're just left with saying, well, that's the way it is. And this ends with the discussion over the EU, which I think is where we start, so is where I will end, where we see all this, I think all these trends combining how to deal with permanent emergencies, how to deal with the changing rules, how to deal with these simultaneous challenges. And to me, I really was very interested in all the different presentations that really made to me much more clear what I think is this really profound cleavage on the one hand between what Europe wants to be, this normative power Europe, external power projection through democracy promotion and human rights on the one hand, and on the other hand, what Europe is or may become securitization, or if it's migratory policy, securitization of basically everything that has to do with its broader geopolitical space and this rising concept of otherness. Ultimately, it seems to me that it's a foreign policy challenge as much as an in-depth identity challenge of who are you and what do you want to be in the future. I also think the main elephant in the room, again, could be that we are again thinking that there is a clash between stability in human rights, and we're choosing stability, but in the end we get neither, and in the process we may actually very well lose our values. Again, I would think that saying this from Jerusalem could offer, unfortunately, a case study, again, my opinion. So to end, I don't have any solution whatsoever. I would never be as pretentious as to pretend to offer a permanent solution, but one of the themes that I think emerged from today's discussion, and I would like to bring back, is actually Wales' original quote in the morning that was talking about how about thinking about the Mediterranean as a common space for common identity, and thinking about the humanitarian challenges happening in the south of the Mediterranean are very much bread and butter of our national security interests for those of us that are in the north of the Mediterranean, talking as a European here. And in Italy, we have this concept of Mare Nostrum as the Mediterranean, which means this is our sea, our space, our community. And perhaps that's a very limited policy-wise, but maybe aspirational thoughts through which to end this day. Through this rethinking about this common space of crisis. And then maybe if we think about it as a common space of crisis, we could think about it as a common space of opportunity in the future. I'll try my best to be positive given the past 10 hours. So thank you so much. Yeah, of course, if you guys want to talk. This is the end of the day, so that's when all formalities end, but if anybody has comments, we have a little bit more time. So.
Let me take your 3 ingredients: law, emergency, and political will or policy. And I think the interplay between these 3 ingredients is very interesting. First of all, permanent emergency is contradiction in terms, which means that if emergency is permanent, it becomes normality. And if we think about countries that are confronting emergency situations, each country is, or some countries are accustomed to certain emergencies that are not perceived as extreme conditions. If in Japan there are an earthquake, an earthquake is not an extreme condition. It's normality. Floods in Europe, as well as terrorism in Israel. We cope with terrorism much better than European countries. So if we are talking about permanent emergency that results from mass migration, or if we have to actually incorporate this into normality and build new rules, new policies that are equipped to the new normality. Now, law, we were talking about the limitation of law, but the one big advantage of legal rules is that they are, in a sense, detached to some way from political interests of the present. Okay, we decide on rules, which are general rules, and if there is a good enforcement mechanism, the rules are applied afterwards or enforced even if they are in contrast to our interests. So I think that the venue or the avenue of new legal regime on the international level, on regional level, is a good avenue to think about how to incorporate or how to translate the permanent new emergency into a new normality. And this relates to the third component of policy or political will. The main disadvantage of democracy is that politicians are thinking on very short term. Okay? They think about how to be re-elected and not about what will happen in 10 or 20 years. This is one of the fallacies, or one of the failures of democracy, or even a paradox of democracy. And especially when we talked about the situation of refugees, you know, the situation of mass immigration or refugees or great humanitarian crisis could have been prevented by the former generation of politicians, and it was not in their interest because they knew that the crisis will erupt, if it will erupt, only after their term. So I think that, again, what this points to is that if we can, you know, step out of the regular thinking and think about in kind of long-term general parameters for a new international legal regime that we incorporate, based on our discussion in the last panel on human rights, refugees, humanitarian law, we might be able to progress. We might be able to start in a certain point, and you know, it's all very, in a sense, fictional because we are not going to enact a new international legal order. But I think that this might be an interesting avenue. And if we think about continuation, a project of continuation, such a discussion group that will try to integrate the various legal fields as well as the various methodologies or systems, the political system, the legal system, the world order system, we might be able to contribute in this realm. And one remark to Ido, tomorrow there is a very important referendum. If the Brits will vote to exit the EU, the relevance of the Mediterranean as a political concept might be, you know, we'll have a big opportunity. So seize the option if it runs.
Should we hope for Brexit? Should we hope for Brexit?
I don't know if we should hope, but if there is, this is not enough. We cannot affect the decision, not anymore, the decision of I know that the Israelis now, some Israelis are telling the Brits, go out, it's the benefit of us. But I don't think that we can really have an effect. But if this happens, I think that the concept of the Mediterranean and the prospects of developing something alternative to the EU around the Mediterranean has greater chances. And this is, you should seize the opportunity.
Why is it to the benefit of Israel? Why is it to Israel's benefit?
Well, some circles argue that since the EU is so anti-Israeli, it's better that the Brits will be outside of the EU and will be allies of the Israelis as opposed to being part of the EU. It's a very, very narrow national perception.
It's a sectarian argument. It's not a universal argument.
To add first, thank you for presenters that I heard and for the organizers. I would add, I think, a fourth element that Benedetta mentioned, and that is stability or instability. And the law provides or can provide stability. So I think that is also, I mean, that's another link. And stability through time and also through regions. Potentially, at least that's what the EU tried to do. So I think that is an important aspect. And another mention that relates to, and I think part of what was talked about today is the fact that instability across a line does not mean that it can be just defined away by drawing the line at a certain geographical point. And I think that is part of what is happening, the way that instability influences areas of stability, and that is both economically and politically in Greece. So if it's Britain or Greece, or so I think that is an important aspect to be added, and that was talked about today. And just to mention one last thing that relates to the specific context of migration, and that is that stable lines do not provide stability. And more Turks emigrated into Germany after the programs of guest workers stopped, because they had to choose at which state to live, so they immigrated through family reunification. More Mexicans immigrated into the U.S. after the Bracero program stops. So once there is a line, you have to choose where to be, and the flexibility is lost. So stability is not only built on firm lines or walls, but also on the ability to cross them back and forth.
Stability or global justice?
Maybe both.
Maybe both.
I would not say global justice as a project, because global justice as a project assumes that the lines are irrelevant often. And I think that this is not, so I think that the lines, or the lines, the political lines, the economic lines, the divides, have to be recognized. And many of the global justice programs that follow a cosmopolitan ideas of justice, I think don't take that into account enough. But I have to think more about that.
Turning it off. I raised it. Nobody responded. Right here. Sir?
המיקרופון מאחוריך. המיקרופון מאחוריך. תסתובב בבקשה.
My comment may be completely out of place because I'm not in the social sciences or in the humanities. My training was in physics. And when we try to understand behavior of physical phenomenon, whether it's in the sky, or astronomy, or in nanotechnology, or what have you, the first thing you have to understand is the constituents. And then the constituents interact. You have to understand not only the atom or the nucleus of the atom, you have to larger entities. Until you understand the whole world, there are many ingredients. It's not for one human being to absorb it all. My question to you is, I don't see any mention of the human element of psychology, because political decisions are made by human beings. And there are psychologists who, for example, I mentioned to Professor Salzberger that there is a psychologist who specializes in decision research in Oregon, Eugene, Oregon, and his name is Slovic. And he, together with his son, who became a professor in Idaho of English literature, they just published last year a book which is called Numbers and Nerves. Numbers refers to data, and nerves refers to individuals, human beings. And so the thought that entered my mind that might be helpful to include some discussion of the psychology of the individual, the decision makers, of groups, and all the fallacies that the decision research people have discovered over the last few decades, and that will then perhaps contribute. That's, and I found it most interesting, thank you for tolerating my presence and my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. There is a field of political psychology of policymakers started with famous research about psychology of Woodrow Wilson, and Dr. Avner Falk, who was here today, wrote about 15 books about this subject. But I think we just had a very packed conference as it is.
I think it's a good place to end, though, because we start and we end with what the center of all these discussions are like. When we talk about assistance and protection, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about individuals. We're talking about people, people's lives. So it's actually a great place to end today, to remember what this is all about. Otherwise, there is no point at all doing any of this. So, yeah.
So thank you very much, everybody.